I knew Julian Pierce was going to be a massive headache the exact second he referred to our premier client as low-hanging fruit. But even before that walking corporate catastrophe rolled into our building, my daily life revolved around spreadsheets, contract red lines, and bulletproof paper trails. It was not glamorous or headline-grabbing, but it was solid. I was the quiet shield in the corner. I had spent 11 years holding the line at Apex Solutions, translating complex legal language into practical business terms, and keeping our largest account happy. That was a massive enterprise client with in-house lawyers who probably billed their time in 20-second increments. They were happy, compliant, and completely lawsuit-free because of my diligence. I was never flashy, and I never needed to be. While eager sales representatives chased impossible quarterly quotas and vice presidents played dress-up for company-wide meetings, I was the sole reason our legal department slept peacefully at night. Every major transaction, clause change, or compliance update, especially with this crucial client, ran directly through me and got copied to our legal counsel like a muscle reflex. Nora Jenkins, our compliance liaison at the client side, even joked once that I was her contractual guardian angel. We had a tight, cautious rhythm that worked beautifully. But perhaps that was the real problem. My kind of protective work does not feel exciting until it is far too late. It is exactly like the seatbelt you complain about until the car crashes. Most days I sat quietly in my office, sipping cold coffee and watching the storm clouds gather around other people's self-inflicted disasters, knowing my work would never be one of them. Which is why what happened next hit me like a high-speed freight train loaded with unpaid invoices and raw arrogance. Before we get into the details of this legal meat grinder, a quick word. If you are one of the many people watching our stories without subscribing, please take a second to hit that button. It helps the channel significantly, and a quick thumbs up is like a cup of hot espresso for our hard-working editor. Now, back to the corporate cleanup. Here is how my daily routine worked. When sales drafted a risky new strategic pivot, I was the one who quietly asked if we had looped the legal team in. When a new product feature crept into regulatory gray areas, I flagged it with a polite email referencing Section 14.2 of our agreement. I was not trying to slow down the business. I was merely making sure the corporate ship did not sink from the inside, and it worked flawlessly. We had no lawsuits and no breach notices. The client's compliance officer sent me thank you emails that read like corporate love letters, praising our clarity and foresight. Internally, I was the calm center of the storm. I was the person people noticed only when they needed something impossible fixed by yesterday. I did not gossip. I did not network with the popular executives, and I did not attend expensive dinners. But if a massive deal was hanging by a thread because someone forgot Clause 9.4, I had already highlighted it, emailed the correction, and filed it under avoided catastrophes. My desk was not next to a window, and I never received the premium parking spot. But when it came time to renegotiate the largest contract in our corporate history, guess who the client demanded to have on every single call? It was me. Not the flashy vice president of revenue, and not some bragging director with a buzzword addiction. It was Carl Thorne. For a brief foolish moment, I actually believed that loyalty and expertise mattered. Then Julian Pierce arrived, fresh from some corporate consulting program that teaches you how to say synergy without laughing. He wore expensive loafers without socks and spoke as if a corporate social media page had come to life. From his very first day, I could feel his disdain. He thought I was just background furniture, and outdated furniture at that. During those final peaceful weeks, before Julian began his reign of error, I was still trusted and looped into every conversation, copying legal on every message. The ship was steady, the logs were tight, and the storm had not made landfall yet. But I could see the dark clouds on the horizon. Julian arrived like a loud magician at a somber gathering, talking about velocity and establishing momentum. He gathered the entire team on his first day to deliver a monologue about redefining our operational agility, which really meant ignoring established processes and hoping we did not get sued. I was the only person in the room who did not nod like a toy doll during his speech. I simply sat there with my hands crossed, drinking from my favorite mug that read "Documentation saves lives." On week 3, Julian led a high-stakes call with the strategic accounts team regarding contract amendments. These were major changes that would have made my inbox explode in the past. Instead, they were happening without any oversight. I raised my virtual hand and asked if we had run the language by Victoria Vance and the legal team. Julian rolled his eyes in front of the entire group. "Stop copying legal on everything," he snapped. "It is complete overkill, and it scares the client by making us look paranoid. We are building relationships here, not running a courtroom." I looked at the screen and saw the junior reps freeze. I paused, muted my microphone, and stared out the window at the gray sky. Then I unmuted, smiled, and said I understood. No fight, no protest. I knew when a hill was not worth dying on, especially in front of an arrogant man who thought policies were optional. But I felt that invisible shift in the room. I was not angry or scared. I was simply ready. I stopped copying legal, physically removing the group email address from my client. If Julian wanted a streamlined process, I would give him absolute silence. I sat in my ergonomic chair and watched the disaster begin. I knew that without a proper check, the company was heading straight toward a cliff, and Julian was pressing the accelerator with a proud smile on his face. My daily routine was simple but required absolute concentration. I would arrive at my desk before the sun rose, make a cup of strong black tea, and start reviewing the transaction logs from the previous day. I wanted to make sure that every single contract we executed was fully aligned with our corporate policies and regulatory standards. I spent hours checking tiny details that others overlooked, cross-referencing names, dates, and account numbers. To most people in the office, my job seemed incredibly boring, but to me, it was like solving a complex puzzle. I took pride in knowing that my attention to detail was the reason our business was so stable. I had seen too many companies fail because they tried to take shortcuts, and I was determined to make sure that Apex Solutions did not become one of them. My old supervisor, who had retired a year ago, always told me that a good compliance officer is like a good referee. If you are doing your job right, nobody even knows you are there. I took that advice to heart, working quietly behind the scenes to keep the peace. But when the new management took over, the entire corporate culture changed overnight. The focus shifted from long-term stability to short-term growth, and suddenly my caution was seen as a barrier to success rather than a protective shield. I watched with quiet fascination as the entire system began to unravel the moment the guardrails were removed. Julian started fast-tracking contract updates, telling the sales team that we were far too valuable to get bogged down in bureaucratic red tape. He called me into his office once to ask if we could just delete some of that boring indemnity language from the upcoming client renewal. I told him calmly that the indemnity language was the only reason our company was not bankrupt. He laughed and told me I was adorable, but that we were playing a different game now. I simply nodded and went back to my desk. From that moment on, I became a ghost in his world. I was no longer invited to strategic planning calls. My advice, which had once been treated like corporate law, became simple background noise. Julian even told the team that they were all adults and should use their own judgment instead of asking the legal department every time they wanted to make a move. I stared at my computer screen and wrote down the date. It felt like information my future self would desperately need to review. I had no intention of playing the martyr or screaming about compliance. I am built like granite, quiet and excellent at long-term erosion. I followed his instructions to the letter. I stopped involving our lawyers, and I watched the client account become more tangled by the day. Every single time something looked wrong, I made a silent note. No drama, just a clean log of facts. The real chaos started with a message at 7:15 in the morning. "Big news coming, be ready to move fast," the text read. By 10:30, Julian was sharing a slide deck titled Expansion Initiative Accelerated Win-Back Strategy. The plan was to push a rapid user expansion with our largest client, double the data volume, ignore the original integration timelines, and get the contract signed by Friday. He completely ignored the fact that our original agreement limited scaling without pre-approved security audits and strict localization protocols for their overseas data. Julian called those legacy bottlenecks. I called them active landmines. The sales team accepted the plan immediately, excited by promises of large bonuses and trips to tropical destinations. By lunchtime, Julian had the team focused entirely on speed and completely allergic to due diligence. The client's representative sent over a draft amendment at 3:45 in the afternoon, and Julian replied within 15 minutes, stating that everything looked great and we should move forward. He never ran the document through the legal department, and he never sent it to me. I only found out about it when I overheard a junior sales representative in the break room asking if they would get in trouble for skipping the mandatory privacy appendix. That was the moment the temperature in my skull dropped to sub-zero. I walked to my desk, opened my private drive, and created a new file labeled Client Expansion Risks, Confidential Internal Notes Only. I wrote down a surgical inventory of every single protocol Julian was breaking. Clause 6.4 required a 90-day written notice for data localization changes, but no notice had been filed. Clause 8.2 stated that scaling the user base beyond a certain threshold required a revised pricing model and formal board sign-off, but no new pricing was proposed. Clause 10.5 mandated an updated data processing agreement for any alterations in data handling, yet no such document existed. There were no alarms and no public arguments. It was just one man with a keyboard and a quiet plan. By the end of the week, I had 15 specific bullet points, all carefully time-stamped and matched with internal messages. I did not feel the need to warn Julian again. I was building a time bomb disguised as a receipt folder. Meanwhile, Julian walked through the office as if he had personally invented the concept of revenue. Sign and close, he kept chanting. He even overrode the automated system I had built to flag contract deviations. I received an alert stating that a deviation had been escalated without legal review, and 15 minutes later, the alert was manually deleted. Julian had disabled the watchdog system entirely. I documented that action as well. It was like watching someone speed through a school zone while shouting about innovation. Everyone wanted to believe his promises because they were tired of slow deals and defensive strategies. Julian offered them an easy shortcut, and they took it eagerly. I did not argue. I did not forward the drafts to Victoria Vance. Julian wanted clean lines of communication, so I made mine incredibly precise. My notes grew, and my silence deepened. I began printing the logs at home, keeping them in a physical folder labeled Vacation Reading. Every time he skipped a step, ignored a system warning, or told a rep to just get it signed, I saved the evidence and moved on. You can only patch a high-pressure valve with tape so many times before it violently explodes, and when it did, I wanted every piece of evidence to point to the exact same truth. I knew my patience would eventually pay off when the corporate reality caught up with his ambitions. The silence in the office was almost palpable as the weeks passed. The junior sales representatives, who had once come to my desk for advice on contract language, now avoided eye contact when we passed in the hallway. They had all witnessed Julian's outburst during the team meeting, and they knew that associating with me was a risky career move. Julian had successfully created an environment where asking questions was seen as a sign of weakness, and everyone was too afraid of losing their bonuses to speak up. I watched as they pushed through incomplete agreements and skipped mandatory security reviews, all in the name of speed. It was a stressful time, but I remained focused on my task. Every evening, I would sit at my desk and update my private log, adding screenshots of Slack conversations, emails, and database records. I made sure to document the exact times and dates of every single transaction that bypassed the standard review process. I knew that when the audit eventually occurred, these records would be my only defense. I was not trying to build a case against Julian out of malice. I was simply protecting myself and the company from the consequences of his arrogance. I kept my head down, did my work, and let the evidence accumulate. The changes became more personal as the weeks went on. The first time I noticed was when a critical email thread regarding the client's technical deployment was forwarded to me by a junior analyst who asked why I had been left off the message. The second time, Julian explicitly removed my name from a reply to a contract discussion. He was not even subtle about it. He pacing around the office, talking about how too many voices muddied the decision stream and that we needed accelerators rather than hall monitors. I simply smiled, nodded, and added a new entry to my private file, dated May 18th. I labeled it Evidence of Intentional Circumvention. Quietly and methodically, I kept the documentation sharp. By the time May arrived, I was completely isolated from any major project. My job title remained the same, but my inbox was empty. What had once been a flood of contract reviews was now a quiet echo chamber of calendar invites that did not require my participation. I had become a ghost with an office badge. That was when the first major violation occurred. An internal update revealed that the client's customer data had been migrated to a regional cloud server in Frankfurt, a location that was not authorized in our current agreement. Under Clause 7.4, any change in data geography required a formal amendment and immediate client notification. Neither had happened. The second violation came 6 days later. A slide deck proudly announced that our user base had expanded by 145% since February. While Julian celebrated this as a massive victory on social media, I knew that Clause 8.2 required a renegotiated pricing structure and board approval for any expansion over 60% of the baseline. None of this had occurred. I sat at my desk, looking at the slide, and decided to send exactly one formal warning to keep my record clean. I sent an email to Julian, copying Sonia Geller, the operations lead. I noted the recent developments regarding user growth and data migration, flagging that Clause 7.4 required an amendment for data shifts and Clause 8.2 required new pricing. I suggested we pause further deployments until legal could advise us. It was not an explosive message, but it was an immutable mark in our corporate history. Julian never replied. Sonia sent a short note acknowledging receipt. I saved the message as a document and added it to my private archive. After that, the office environment became even colder. Julian praised self-starters who did not need hand-holding, and I became little more than an expensive paperweight. I was excluded from meetings and removed from email threads, but I continued to document every single interaction. They could erase me from the schedule and strip me from the copy lines, but they could not delete the digital audit trail I was building. You do not need to raise your voice when you are holding all the receipts. The notification came at 9:12 in the morning. It was a calendar invitation for a meeting titled Restructure Alignment and Talent Optimization. I clicked accept immediately. I had seen this play before, but this time I was not standing under the blade. 15 minutes later, I could hear Julian laughing in the conference room next door. He was on a call with Nora Jenkins, our contact at the client company, boasting about how agile and fast our deployments had become without outdated processes. I stared at my screen and saw the formal message from Human Resources. My role was being eliminated as part of a strategic realignment. My final day would be in 3 weeks, with no transition plan required. Shortly after, Julian called me directly, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He told me it was not about my performance, but that the company was moving into a faster lane and needed people who could keep up. I said nothing for 5 seconds, letting the silence stretch between us, before stating that I understood. I spent the remainder of the day quietly packing my personal items and securing my backups. Everything stayed within the company's network, but I sent one final message to the compliance board shadow inbox. The subject line read Contractual Risk Indicator Strategic Accounts Expansion. I attached a 16-page summary of every infraction, date-stamped and cross-referenced. I did not predict disaster, I merely laid out the facts. And then, I walked out of the office. I was ready for whatever came next, knowing I had built a perfect shield for myself while Julian had built his own corporate gallows. Being excluded from the company's daily operations was a strange experience. I would sit in my office for hours with nothing to do but monitor the automated systems and watch my inbox remain empty. It felt as if I was already gone, a ghost haunting the corridors of a company that had decided it no longer needed my services. I spent my time reviewing the old compliance guidelines and organizing my personal files, preparing for the day when the hammer would finally fall. I knew my time at Apex Solutions was limited, but I was determined to leave on my own terms with my professional reputation intact. When the notification for the restructuring meeting finally arrived, I felt a sense of relief rather than panic. The anticipation of the end is often worse than the end itself. I knew that once I was out of the building, the countdown to the client's audit would begin, and there was nothing Julian could do to stop it. I packed my belongings into a single cardboard box, said goodbye to Sylvia, and walked out into the afternoon sun without looking back. I had done my job, and now it was time for the system to run its course. I spent the first few days of my termination enjoying the quiet. I sat on my porch, drank coffee, and let the stress of the last 11 years fade away. I knew the storm was coming, but I was finally outside the impact zone. I spent my mornings working in my garden, reading books, and avoiding the urge to check my old workspace accounts. I was completely disconnected, and it felt wonderful. The first sign of trouble arrived on a Wednesday morning when Sonia Geller sent a message to my personal email address. It contained a single screenshot of a formal letter from the client's legal department. The header read Notice of Material Breach and Intent to Terminate Agreement. The grounds for the breach were exactly what I had documented. Unauthorized data migration to Frankfurt, failure to execute a revised data processing agreement, and user expansion exceeding the contract limits by 145% without board approval or revised pricing. The client was demanding a $3,500,000 penalty and threatening to walk away from the entire $19,500,000 partnership. Julian's entire career was built on this specific expansion, and now it was sitting on the chopping block. I did not reply to Sonia. There was nothing left for me to say. Later that afternoon, another former colleague sent me a message stating that the office was in absolute chaos. The executive team was scrambling, trying to figure out how this had happened and who was responsible. I pictured Julian sweating in a closed boardroom, trying to explain how his agile strategy had led to a multi-million-dollar disaster. The next morning, Victoria Vance, the senior legal counsel, was brought in to lead the internal investigation. She demanded to see every single email, approval, and contract draft from the last 6 months. She wanted to know why the legal department had never been consulted on the expansion. The operations team scrambled to find documents, but there was no paper trail because Julian had bypassed every single control. That was when Maya Cruz, a junior risk analyst, found the email I had sent to the compliance board shadow inbox the day before I was laid off. She opened the 16-page document and read the detailed breakdown of every single contract violation, complete with dates, times, and clause citations. She immediately brought the document to Victoria, who read it in silence before forwarding it directly to the general counsel. The existence of my report changed everything. Julian could no longer claim that this was a simple mistake or a failure of the system. It was a documented warning that had been deliberately ignored to push a deal through. The executive team realized that the company had no legal defense. They had been warned in writing by their senior compliance specialist, and they had fired him 24 hours later. Sonia told me that the internal messages were flying back and forth like panic signals. The general counsel pulled the system logs and confirmed that the warning email had been received. And they also found the records showing Julian had manually disabled the contract watchdog system. The trap was fully set, and the board had no choice but to call an emergency session on Sunday to address the crisis. I sat at home, pouring a cold drink, and let the news wash over me. For years, I had been the invisible compliance officer whose warnings were treated as unnecessary hurdles. Now my final report was the only document that mattered in the entire building. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was the silence of pure accountability. The board members were finally realizing that ignoring the rules had a very specific, very expensive price tag, and Julian was about to pay it in full. The news of the breach notice did not surprise me in the slightest. I had spent months documenting the exact sequence of events that led to this disaster, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the client's compliance team discovered the violations. Nora Jenkins was too professional to overlook such a massive shift in their data geography, and she had a duty to protect her own company's interests. I could only imagine the panic that was spreading through the executive offices as they realized they had no defense. Julian had spent months boasting about his agility, and now he was realizing that speed is useless if you are running in the wrong direction. The board of directors, who had rubber-stamped his expansion plans without asking questions, was now facing the reality of a $3,500,000 penalty and the loss of their largest source of revenue. They were learning the hard way that compliance is not an optional extra. It is a fundamental requirement of doing business in a regulated market. I sat in my garden, watched the birds, and enjoyed the quiet, knowing that my evidence was safe and ready to be revealed when the time was right. The emergency board meeting began at 9 in the morning on Sunday. There were no polite introductions or catered lunches. The room was filled with tense executives and silent board members. Julian Pierce sat at the end of the table, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking as he tried to adjust his collar. Victoria Vance opened the presentation, displaying my 16-page compliance report on the large screen. She walked the board through the timeline, showing how every single contract violation had been flagged by me before my role was eliminated. Julian tried to defend himself, arguing that he was operating under a corporate mandate for growth and that I had also failed to involve the legal team. But Victoria cut him off immediately, pointing out that Julian had explicitly ordered me to stop copying legal, and that I had followed company protocol by escalating the risks to the designated board alias. The general counsel then spoke, his voice flat and deliberate. He explained that because Julian had signed the expansion amendment without a board resolution, and in direct violation of the corporate bylaws, his actions were ultra vires. Under corporate law, this lack of authority rendered the amendment void ab initio, meaning it was completely invalid from the very beginning. As a result, Apex Solutions could not legally enforce the new pricing structure to recover their costs, yet they remained fully liable for the data geography violations. By disabling the watchdog system and actively hiding the transaction from legal, Julian had committed a severe breach of fiduciary duty, exposing the company to $65 million in total damages and penalties. The board chairwoman, Evelyn Harper, closed her folder and stated that the record was entirely clear. Julian was terminated immediately for cause. His stock options were canceled, and the company prepared to face the legal fallout. The next day, I received a phone call from Evelyn Harper. She did not offer excuses. She simply asked if I would return to Apex Solutions to lead the new compliance department. I told her I would consider it, but only under my own strict terms. I demanded that my entire former team be fully reinstated with back pay and significant bonuses for the distress they had experienced. I demanded the authority to personally approve every hire in the finance department. I demanded Julian's former corner office, and most importantly, I refused to sign any non-disclosure agreement. I told her I would never sign away my right to speak the truth. Evelyn studied my terms and accepted every single one of them. 2 weeks later, I walked back into the corporate headquarters. The employees watched me with a new sense of respect as I walked to my new office. I was no longer the quiet guy in the corner whose work was ignored. I was the director of compliance, and my first act was to establish the Thorn Protocols, a system that ensured no contract could ever bypass legal review again. I hired Sonia Geller as my second-in-command and brought back my former colleagues to rebuild the department. Sometimes it takes a massive collapse to show a company the true value of the people who keep them safe. I sat at my new desk, looked out the window at the city skyline, and realized that being quiet does not mean you are powerless. It simply means you are waiting for the right moment to speak. The compliance department was now the strongest division in the company, and we were just getting started on rebuilding our reputation on a foundation of absolute transparency and integrity. The implementation of the Thorn Protocols was a turning point for Apex Solutions. It was not just about restoring the old rules. It was about building a culture where compliance was respected and valued at every level of the organization. I spent my first month as director conducting training sessions for the sales and operations teams, explaining the real-world consequences of bypassing security checks and data localization rules. I wanted them to understand that the rules were not there to slow them down, but to protect them and the company from ruin. Sonia Geller proved to be an invaluable partner in this effort, using her operational expertise to help streamline our review processes without compromising on safety. We rebuilt the compliance department from the ground up, hiring new analysts who shared our commitment to detail and integrity. It was hard work, but we could see the results in the renewed trust of our clients and the stability of our operations. I sat in my new corner office, looking out at the city skyline, and knew that we had built something that would last long after I was gone. We had turned a disaster into a foundation for the future.